In 1928, the future King Edward VIII went on a lavish hunting safari with the real-life cast of Out of Africa.
Affairs were begun, flirtation went on, and as they drank in the evening, they would misbehave.
Edward's own home movies from East Africa have lain unseen in the Royal Archives for decades. But now released and shown in this programme for the first time, they tell an extraordinary story.
Edward was a pioneer, and he set a new course for the royal family.
The prince was one of the first to realise that safari hunting was out of control, and without regulation, it threatened to wipe out Africa's wildlife.
It had become a competition simply to see how many animals the tourist could kill in one day.
Confronted with the blood-soaked reality, Edward was persuaded to spearhead the first modern campaign to end the slaughter.
Without this kind of pressure from Prince of Wales, I don't think there would have been any significant conservation in British colonial Africa.
Long before Edward abandoned the throne for Mrs. Simpson, this safari revealed another side to the prince. This is the story of how the royal playboy became the unlikely saviour of the Serengeti. On the 6th of September 1928, Edward, Prince of Wales, left London for East Africa with no plans to return until after Christmas. At 34, the prince was next in line to rule, a role he would eventually reject. But even now, his distaste for majesty was clear.
Prince Edward loathed Buckingham Palace. He loathed the panoply of majesty. He loathed stiffness, formality. He found family life hideously boring. Nobody could call him cheerful.
Official visits around the empire had provided the prince something of an escape, but he still felt shackled by these trips.
He had been all around India, he'd been to Australia, he'd been to South Africa. Always on these tours, he'd been working. There'd been no freedom about it, no liberty about it. He was fully dressed up, on parade, being inspected, and knowing that he was a centre of attention.
For the prince, this unofficial trip to East Africa was the break he needed. From the start of the journey, he was in holiday mood, and the further from the palace he got, the happier he became. After 3 weeks, Edward reached Mombasa on the coast. The prince had planned a 2-month safari in the British East African colonies. Starting in Kenya, Edward would then travel the lakes and rivers of Uganda before heading back down into Tanganyika territory, modern-day Tanzania.
Well, when the prince arrived and then took the train up to Nairobi, he entered a world that in many ways would have been familiar to him. There was a very small sector of white society who enjoyed doing the kind of things the prince enjoyed doing at home, having dances, playing golf. Horse racing was a big thing, drinking a lot, as much adultery as possible. And he took to that like a duck to water.
Kenya could have been designed for the prince. Basking in equatorial sunshine, it was British in feel, but far more relaxed than home. Reasons that also persuaded historian Errol Trubinsky to stay on for 60 years beyond her first visit.
The prince was a party boy. He loved parties. And I suppose when he was in view of the palace in that sense, he could never really let his hair down, but here he certainly could, and nobody would criticize him for it.
He led a riotous social life in Nairobi. The constant stream of dances, nightclubs, festivities, mistresses, which were the background to his life in London, were there in a more exaggerated and less concealed form in Nairobi.
Edward stayed at Government House, from where he performed the bare minimum of official duties. He deliberately left his dress uniforms at home, and more often than not was hungover. One night, he even made a rather desperate bid for freedom.
He couldn't wait to get away. And that's why the Prince climbed down a drain pipe and went off to Methaga Club and stayed there till 4 in the morning.
Real escape came when Edward went off on safari. And the man to make it all possible was the Honourable Dennis Finch-Hatton, a legendary aristocrat hunter who had been in Kenya for nearly 20 years. Dennis's extraordinary life as a hunter-turned-safari guide was expertly portrayed on the silver screen by Robert Redford in the Oscar-winning movie Out of Africa. Redford's movie star looks rather flatter the real Dennis, but he did have good breeding. As the son of an earl, he was the right sort of chap to look after a prince. And like Edward, Dennis completely understood the claustrophobia of the English upper classes.
Back in the UK, I think he had a certain position with his family. There's a role and a path you have to follow, and it's written for you, and that's your life. In Africa, you can be who you want to be, do what you want to do, and it's freedom, pure freedom.
Dennis and the prince struck up an immediate friendship that would have an impact on wildlife conservation neither could have anticipated. In a ramshackle collection of safari trucks, the two men set off on a remarkable journey, seen here for the first time in the prince's private films. At first, Prince Edward enjoyed the thrill of big game hunting, stalking and shooting the dangerous animals put before him by his safari guide.
The big game safari of the 1920s was really what it sounds like. It was going out and bagging the big five, the elephant, the rhino, the buffalo, the lion, the leopard. And if you shot all five in the course of the safari, you were the ultimate hunter.
Edward opened his account with a crocodile on the banks of the Victoria Nile, though he soon set his sights on far bigger animals.
Edward relished danger. I think probably one of the moments he enjoyed most in Africa was when he was actually charged by an elephant. And he and I think it was Tommy Lascelles sort of debated which one ought to shoot. And after you, said, no, after you, Tommy. Until it reached a point at which the elephant practically ran them down, which caused a moment the white hunter with them. So pushed up to one side, shot the elephant. And in a rather nervous way, the Prince of Wales said, does that often happen? And the white hunter said, no, sir, we do not often ask around arguing who's going to shoot the animal.
One certainly had to have nerves of steel as a white hunter in those days, particularly when the heir to the throne was stalking alongside you.
Fired up by the danger, the prince then wanted a lion. For this, Dennis invited along his friend, Baron Braw von Blixen. Another aristocrat hunter immortalized in Out of Africa, Blixen was a lion hunter with few equals.
Braw Blixen was first and foremost a brilliant professional hunter. He was also tough as nails. He went out before breakfast, located these lions, got back into camp and told the prince that I think we might have a lion for you.
Blixen took the excited prince into the bush to flush the lions out.
The prince takes a shot, misses, takes a second shot and brings it down. So the prince, all delight and everything, starts to rush up to the corpse and it's just comes out of the ground at him.
Only a lucky reaction shot saved his life. It was another very close shave.
Then he would have been killed or mauled. And when a lion mauls you, septicemia sets in almost immediately, and you can lose a leg through gangrene very quickly.
Despite the near miss, the prince was elated. He had bagged 2 of the big 5. What he didn't realize was that wildlife in East Africa was coming under serious threat. Big game animals were being shot in huge numbers by rich tourists on newly fashionable safaris like his. Safari had become popular following the visit of former US President Theodore Roosevelt, who came to Kenya on an extended hunting trip in 1909.
Roosevelt's safari was one of a kind. Don't forget, he had just stepped down from the presidency as an extraordinary, successful president. And so he came out on a lavish safari, which was 9 months in all.
Everything about Roosevelt's safari was supersized. The trip cost over $1 million, upwards of $25 million today, and 500 guides and porters were needed to carry piles of equipment into the bush. But it was the wildlife body count that was truly excessive. Over the course of his safari, Roosevelt's bloodthirsty party killed over 11,000 animals. The former president personally shot 2,000 animals, including 13 rare rhino. Some 5,000 of these creatures were skinned and later stuffed at the new National Museum in Washington, where many were assembled in lifelike dioramas and exhibited in the natural history galleries.
I still find it amazing to believe that Roosevelt's count on a 9-month safari was 11,000 animals. Up until that time, you never had a scale of killing animals that would justify literally hundreds of skinners and porters, and I think that's what made it seem so appalling to people.
But far from deter hunters, Roosevelt's trip drew them in their thousands. Then the arrival of the motor car opened up the interior on a massive scale. By the end of the 20s, the tourist safari was out of control, unleashing a casual slaughter of the wildlife. Without intervention, the big game of East Africa could become extinct within a generation. Oblivious to the bigger picture of wholesale animal slaughter, Edward was having the time of his life, lording it up in the bush with his aristocratic chums. And after every long day's hunting, it was back to camp, where every conceivable luxury was on hand. Calvin Cotter keeps the spirit of 20s safari alive at his camp, which has been in the family for 4 generations.
This camp is really the best of the 1920s style and emulates a lot of the out of Africa feel of safari. The camps were ornate. They would have canvas baths, they would have champagne, they would have grand pianos at times, and it was all about luxury, clean linen after a hard day, 4-course meals, everything you could possibly want after a really tough day on safari.
And it was Dennis Finch-Hatton's job to provide this kind of luxury for the Prince of Wales.
The kind of safaris that Finch-Hatton and Broadbrixton led were only for the very wealthy. The crystal glasses were always packed. There was no shortage of champagne and very good wine. They had ice-making machines. The cooks would be the best, and the food would be absolutely delicious. So it was kind of like 5-star luxury in the bush.
The camp staff ironed the linen and served food and wine as if in the best Nairobi restaurant. Always to the backdrop of music.
Dennis was quite passionate about music in general. Once he could get a portable gramophone, he took it into the bush with him. Mozart in the bush is exquisite. I don't know why it is, but it's just perfect because it goes with the bush in that extraordinary way that classicism does.
Camping in such luxury the prince was blithely unaware of the dramatic impact that the tourist safari was having. And yet the wild animals of East Africa were under intense pressure. Since the 19th century, East Africa had lost up to 12,000 elephants a year to the ivory trade. And the 20th century brought further conflict between man and beast through the expansion of agriculture. Tony Seth Smith has now turned his land over to an animal conservancy. But for decades, his family fought a running battle with the local wildlife on their farm.
My father came out here in 1904. To them, it was all adventure, and rather like, I suppose, it must have been for the people in the States, the Wild West, and, you know, go west, my son, you know, that's where the adventure is. And that was the same thing here. When they came out here, there was nothing. They cleared their first land, put their crops in, then the animals just came and ate them. And a lot of people put all their money into this bit of land that they were given, and they lost it all. They shot flat out at anything coming on their land. So you were out there shooting buffalo, a leopard that was killing your sheep. I mean, leopard in those days were as numerous as foxes are in England today, I'd say. I remember as a child going out and chasing the ostriches out of the wheat. Hyenas, leopard and lion. All those animals were vermin until the late 1930s. So it was a question of them or you, the farmer.
But it was a new type of hunting that threatened to tip the precarious balance between man and beast once and for all. Over the light of a flickering campfire, Dennis Finch-Hatton told Prince Edward of the growing slaughter on the African plains.
Finch-Hatton was particularly concerned, incensed really, about a new practice that had not been there when he arrived in East Africa, of shooting from cars, particularly Americans. There'd be a party would set out from Nairobi, spend a week or 2 weeks, and they would just shoot animals, sometimes 20 lion in a day. It had become a competition in some quarters, simply to see how many animals the tourist could kill in one day.
It's fair to say that it was a slaughter. It doesn't take more than 30, 40 hunters who are shooting that sort of bag to have a huge impact on lions. Today in Kenya, we only have 2,100 lions left in the whole of Kenya.
Technology was rapidly changing the game, and ethical hunters like Dennis were appalled by this ungentlemanly hunting.
With cars, people could get very close to wild game, and it became a lot easier to shoot them. People who were not very good shots could shoot, and that was something that Dennis Finch-Hatton and many others really didn't like. It upset their sense of the virtuous hunter as someone who had great expertise, and of course it also ran the risk that they wouldn't shoot accurately, and then they would not kill wildlife cleanly and quickly.
Dennis's greatest concern was for a small area of open plain on the Kenya-Tanganyika border, known as the Serengeti.
I think the reason that Finch-Hatton really got concerned about Serengeti is two things. First of all, yes, it's very easy to get the vehicle in there. It's very open plain for the most part, and even the eastern woodlands are very open. But secondly, it had the richest wildlife of anywhere that he had seen, and any of us have seen since.
Dennis knew that the time had come to protect the animals, and he sensed that Edward could be a useful ally in stopping the slaughter. In fact, pangs of conscience had already started to upset the prince.
After he'd killed his first elephant, Prince Edward, I think genuinely, felt a sense of compunction and wondered whether really this was the right way of treating these majestic animals. He wrote in his diary long afterwards, "Most of all is an elephant uninspiring to kill, because though his appearance may belie him, he looks so old, so gently imbecile, so wisely pathetic, but to want to hurt him seems as unthinkable as it would be to want to hurt an old gentleman from the almshouse.
For all his faults, the prince did have a very soft side. He was a softie in many ways, and Finch-Hatton was a good storyteller. So you can imagine that the Prince of Wales would have listened to these stories and thought, yeah, you know, it's just absolutely outrageous for people to come and just point their rifles out of a car window as it's going along and shoot all these animals and then move on.
You can't just allow elephant to be slaughtered and game to be slaughtered by people who shoot with automatic rifles from cars. You won't have any game left from a start, but it's wrong. The game doesn't stand a chance.
Dennis told the prince that there was another way. The previous year, Finch-Hatton had taken a wealthy American businessman, Frederick B. Patterson, on safari. He was not motivated by trophies for the wall. Instead, he took 2 motion picture cameras with him to record the wildlife. Patterson later wrote,
"In my 5 months in Africa, I always found picturing game far more interesting and difficult than shooting it. Only having a 6-inch lens meant I had to get much closer to my animal, making the risk greater."
Together, Patterson and Finch-Hatton shot some 17,000 feet of film.
Dennis had never come across this before. All his life he's been looking for game so far for people who want to shoot, and now he's looking at it through completely different eyes.
For the first time, he saw East Africa through the lens of a camera, and I think it was a kind of epiphany, because he saw this ancient and pristine landscape that needed to be protected. And also he saw that, of course, photography was almost as dangerous as hunting, because you had to get close to the same animals who could kill you in exactly the same way.
Edward immediately embraced Finch-Hatton's passion for photography. Borrowing a movie camera from the governor, the 2 men set out to shoot wildlife. Only this time, on film. On the first day, the prince risked life and limb filming these actual shots of an elephant. An experience he found just as exciting as hunting with a rifle.
I think that the Prince of Wales was a very brave man, and a man who did not calculate risks. And I suspect that the excitement of using your camera close to a large and dangerous and potentially hostile animal must have added a kind of free of excitement to the, anyway, great pleasure of photographing in these conditions.
The prince was hooked and walked for miles with his camera, stalking animals for hours on end in order to capture these remarkable pictures. He wrote in his memoirs,
"I enjoyed this open-air life of hard exercise, so much so that I find it difficult to believe that anyone would ever voluntarily choose to return to civilization."
But Edward's paradise was brutally interrupted.
Everybody seemed to be enjoying the safari immensely when suddenly telegrams started appearing in the hands of runners, and bear in mind it took a long time for a telegram to get to them, saying that the king was ill. And in each telegram, the king emerged as being iller. And some of the telegrams were from Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, begging the prince to come home, because obviously if the king were to expire, the heir to the throne really needed to be there.
Edward was right out in the wilds, having a time of his life. And his reaction, and it still surprises me to this day, that he simply refused to believe it. He said, "This is a put-up job by that cunning Prime Minister who wants to get me back for his own purposes, and I'm not having any of it, and I've no intention of giving up my holiday."
"Sir," replied Lascelles, Prince's private secretary, "the King of England is dying, and if that means nothing to you, it means a great deal to the rest of us." He looked at me, the exhausted Lascelles wrote in his journal, went out without a word, and spent the remainder of the evening in the successful seduction of a Mrs. Barnes, wife of the local commissioner. He told me so himself the next morning.
Reluctantly, he packed up and headed back for London. But it was touch and go. Given any more encouragement, like he would have stayed where he was and let his father die or not die, as the case may be.
As Edward waited for a warship on the coast of Zanzibar, depression set in. His newly found freedom was gone. But memories of Africa and a determination to do something about the abuse of wildlife would stay with him. Prince Edward was rushed home from East Africa, a journey of 10 days by warship and train. All the way he had feared the worst. And yet, on reaching the king's bedside at Buckingham Palace, he found his father far from death's door. "Now, tell me about the elephants," the old man said to his son. George V remained weak for many months, however, forcing Edward to assume many of his father's day-to-day duties.
I think that having to abandon his safari and get back into a London in which he was even more than before so bound up in all the trammels of monarchy and the obligations of his job was for him acutely depressing.
But thoughts of Africa did not leave Edward, with his precious archive of film acting as a permanent reminder. The prince even kept one foot in the bush by accepting a public position in support of animal preservation, the first in a long line of royals to do so.
When the Prince of Wales came back from his safari in Africa, he agreed to become the patron of the Society for the Protection of the Fauna of the Empire in London. They were one of the first conservation organisations founded, and they were the first to have this kind of global reach across the British Empire.
And despite the 4,000 miles between them, the prince and Dennis remained in touch by letter. Edward wrote,
"I hope we can safari together someday. I will make East Africa again."
Hunting from cars remained a burning issue for Dennis, and he asked for Edward's help to stop the slaughter in East Africa.
In tandem, they would try and bring this to the great and the good who could have power in London to stop the hunting from cars in the Serengeti, to stop the slaughter of the game.
To make his political campaign work, Dennis needed profile, and for that, he needed the Prince of Wales.
So we think today about the power of celebrities in campaigns, Bono or Angelina Jolie, but it was just the same in the 1920s. The prince wasn't just royalty, he was a celebrity, and he transformed the campaign just by supporting it.
It must have been, from Finch-Hatton's point of view, a tremendous plus to have this slightly maverick figure on your side, knowing that anything he said would be reported all around the world, would be news.
First blood fell to the prince. On the 27th of June 1929, he made a rousing speech to the East Africa Dinner Club in London.
I am not a frenzied hunter of game or collector of trophies. Record heads do not mean very much to me, while the idea of going out in a motor car to massacre game at close quarters, well, I don't care for that at all.
The speech was reported in full in the Times.
The Times was the newspaper of Great Britain, and it was much respected overseas. You could say that the Prince of Wales kicked the door open for Dennis, and he walked through.
The next day, Dennis followed up with a feature.
He is given the whole of the right-hand outside column on a right-hand page. That is the prime place for somebody who wants to get a point across. In the article, he talks about the horrors of people going into the Serengeti and shooting with automatic rifles from cars, and what this is going to do to the game.
The picture was being painted by Finch-Hatton of how these animals were being slaughtered in a willful way, just a pointless way from cars. It wasn't the noble sport of old.
And that simple argument that he made about unsportsmanlike behaviour was quite widely recognised as a pretty reasonable argument.
Dennis followed his words with powerful pictures.
2 pages later, we have Wonderful photographs taken by Dennis himself. People who opened this page didn't expect to see elephant above the honours list. Certainly they didn't. Would have had a huge impact. Huge.
Finch-Hatton charged the colonial authority in Tanganyika with turning a blind eye in the Serengeti.
He accuses them of complacency. Now he's pointing a finger directly at the Tanganyika government, and he is demanding an answer.
Within days, a very public spat had developed.
On July the 9th, the Tanganyika government had written accusing Finch-Hatton of reckless statements. So the next day, Finch-Hatton writes a long letter rebutting those accusations.
He basically blames them for not controlling tourism. And the government comes back and says, well, actually, we try to, it's very difficult, it's people sneaking over the border from Kenya, and they basically excuse themselves in the way that governments conventionally do, that this is difficult, but we're trying to do something about it.
Dennis was implacable. He was not going to let the Tanganyika government get away with this.
Dennis and the Prince identified that protecting the Serengeti was the key to protecting the wildlife there.
This is a critical moment. This is a moment when people are starting to focus attention on one particular place, one particular region, and sort of in that moment you see the whole pattern of conservation debate in the 20th century starting to gather momentum.
Dennis appealed for the Serengeti to be closed to hunting.
Finch-Hatton knew a lot of very important people, including politicians, and really did what he could to get the word going. It went viral, we'd say these days.
And thanks to the Prince's influence, the matter was debated in the House of Lords in November, where even the Archbishop of Canterbury had something to say. With a government inspector on his way from London, the Tanganyikan authorities, with egg on their face, finally agreed to clamp down on the abuses and close the Serengeti to hunting. Dennis and the Prince had won the first round. By the end of the year, the king's health had improved sufficiently for Edward to once again escape the hated princing and kinging at the palace. And the first thing he wanted to do was head back to East Africa and finish off his safari. And on this trip, he would take his collection of the latest 16mm movie cameras.
Prince Edward loved technology. He was fascinated by new gadgets, so this became an extra reason for him to want to go back to Africa, because by doing so he'd be able to play with his new, most exciting toy.
And with filming his primary objective, the Prince was to prove that the use of motor cars in the bush need not be destructive. The Wolseley Motor Company had provided the Prince of Wales with 7 brand new luxury cars for his safari, and Harry Sayer was the company rep sent out to keep them going.
These cars were driven to their limit, driving straight through the bush, which, as my father describes, contained anthills like concrete, bushes, trees, shrubs, and occasionally tree trunks. So this bush was no tuppenny halfpenny bush, it was real tough terrain. And the Prince drove very briskly indeed, and he describes how he managed to keep up his speed, but of course you skid round corners, he said. And this is the Prince's car stuck in sand, and it was nothing special. Oh, it's a car stuck in sand, stuck in mud, stuck somewhere, and we just pull it out and carry on.
Despite the challenges, the cars reached the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, where the Prince's entourage set up camp on the Kenya-Tanganyika border, in an area known for its elephants and rhino. Reunited with Dennis in the bush, the Prince was happy again. And he immediately wanted to start filming big game. Only this time, he wanted to get closer than ever before, which would endanger not only his life, but that of the animals.
The fact that the Prince was shooting in 1930 with a camera rather than a gun didn't make Finch-Hatton's job any less nerve-wracking. For example, there was one occasion when the Prince was filming a sleeping rhino and the whir of the camera woke the rhino up.
These images were filmed by the Prince himself.
The rhino began to charge, first of all slowly, and then got faster and faster.
Finch-Hatton killed the rhino with a well-directed shot. I think the Prince, with one eye on the eyepiece filming, hadn't realised how dangerously near the rhino was. But it was dangerous enough for Dennis to shoot it.
At which point the Prince jerked his head up from his camera and said, "How dare you? I did not give you permission to shoot that rhino." And Finch-Hatton said, "Your Royal Highness, please try and look at this from my point of view. If you, the heir to the throne, had been killed while you were under my care, I would have had no choice but to go behind a tree and blow my brains out."
This unfortunate death played on the Prince's conscience, which is clear from his edited film. But he persisted with his hobby, enthusiastically pushing the envelope of wildlife photography to the limit of both his own safety and Finch-Hatton's sanity. The unique pictures he captured are an important legacy in their own right, and his efforts with a camera were to have a profound effect on hunting, tourism, and the wildlife of Africa that would last way beyond his lifetime. On his second safari, Edward, Prince of Wales, was deeply happy filming big game with his motion picture camera. He was joined in the bush by the glitterati of Nairobi's aristocratic set, including the governor, Baron and Baroness von Blixen, and Lady Finesse, his current mistress, who took the opportunity to surreptitiously spend time with him.
The Prince brought his girlfriend on that trip, whom he referred to as Toodles, and her husband was also in the country, but rather wisely kept away from the safari. So it was one of those truths that everybody knew but nobody said.
They cut a landing strip and they could fly in and out, which was, of course, a great leap forward in terms of communication and getting supplies in.
So as usual, they had their ice machines and their phonograph, and everybody got dressed for dinner, and it was as if they'd brought the high life of Nairobi down there into the bush, and I think they had a high old time for quite a few days.
It had all the appearance of a picnic, and several days of hijinks followed. But Edward remained serious about his photography, and what he referred to as the art circle followed his lead, setting out every day to take wildlife pictures. And it was from groups of like-minded photographers like these that the camera safari grew in popularity. Until today, it is the only way to get close to big game in Kenya. Carr and Downey have organised photographic safaris since the 1940s. Senior field guide Martin Seth Smith may have grown up in a hunting family, but today he regularly takes camera-toting clients to the same spots that the Prince filmed in.
This is exactly where Finch-Hatton and Blixen would have taken the Prince with his camera out in this sort of terrain and teach him how to get close to these things and film safely. That was part of the excitement, and still part of the excitement. You never know exactly where you're going to come across anything. Effectively, we're carrying on that same tradition.
Like Dennis Finch-Hatton, Donald Carr and Sid Downey were hunters and safari guides who could see that the camera was the future. Their post-war safaris maintained the tradition of luxury camping, but they promoted shooting animals on film, and many of their clients, including Prince Charles, the current Prince of Wales, were lured by the promise of photographic adventure.
Okay. There's an elephant up ahead of us. So, we'll try and get a little bit closer up to it. Okay. Ecco maji hapo. Ecco maji pale hapo chini. Yeah, so it's going for water. Slowly making his way into the apple.
In my father's generation, the trophies that you got were all buffalo heads, lion skins, leopard skins. Whereas for us, it's trying to get the great photograph, the great view, the twinkle in the eye, all of the things that cinematography teaches you.
Back in 1930, with wildlife photography in its infancy, Edward had to experiment to get his shots. And the images that the future king and emperor captured are truly remarkable. He recorded animals in their natural habitat, creatively played with film speed, and even focused on the smallest of creatures.
They were breaking ground. Now we watch television and documentaries on the animals, but they were already doing it in their way. And that's why there's such unique shots.
At the end of each long day, the prince had his mistress on standby.
So everybody would be out filming animals by day, then they'd come back and the porters would fill their tin baths, and then they'd have a sundown, and then they'd have dinner. And Finch-Hatton put the prince's tent at the end of the line and Toodle's tent next to his, so that they could all be very discreet and pretend they didn't know what was going on. And Toodles writes very romantically about nights of rhapsody.
I don't think there's any doubt that the months he spent on safari in Africa were among the happiest and the most satisfying of his life.
The prince continued to push his camera skills, taking to the skies to become one of the earliest generation of cameramen to film wildlife from the air.
Yes, in a way, for Prince Edward, filming wild animals from the air must have been a sublime experience, because it was the ultimate escape. And he cared about the animals he was filming, he cared about the process of filming, and to pursue these pleasures he was prepared to take considerable risks. It was a moment of complete liberty, of complete satisfaction, and I think it probably meant a lot to him.
Edward's films captured Africa at a turning point. Alerted by the prince's campaign the previous year, the British government was drawing up legislation to establish protected national parks in its East Africa colonies, and top of the list was the Serengeti. Dr. David Weston, conservationist and former head of the Kenya Wildlife Service, has worked in many of East Africa's national parks over the past 40 years. Each month, he flies over the same landscape that Prince Edward once did, monitoring animal populations in a bid to counter poaching.
In the 1930 period, when the prince came here and flew over this land, what they recognized is that animals concentrate in areas like Serengeti during the dry season. These are the critical areas they really have to save. They had a vision. They were saying, we can preserve a portion of this. Not all of it, but we want some sort of template that is as Africa was as we've seen it. And we want this to be there for all humankind, for all mankind, and for all time. So we owe them a great deal.
Thanks to that vision, there are over 50 national parks and reserves in Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda today, providing a vital chain of safe havens for East Africa's wildlife. From the dust of Kilimanjaro, the prince drove on through the forests and mountains of Uganda and across the rivers of the Belgian Congo, before ending his safari in southern Sudan in early April. From there, it was at last time for the prince to head home. Daredevil to the end, he hitched a lift with the Royal Air Force as far as Egypt. Dennis and the prince parted company and would never see each other again. Tragically, Dennis was killed in a flying accident the following year. And Edward would achieve notoriety by becoming king and emperor in 1936, only to turn it all down for Wallis Simpson. But what they achieved together in Africa, particularly in the Serengeti, would long outlast them both.
The Prince and Dennis Finch-Hatton have never had the recognition that they deserve, because unless it had been brought to the House of Lords, the place would never have been gazetted as a place of conservation for the animals.
Looking back, I think we realise that we owe these penitent butchers, these big game hunters turned conservationists, a great deal for bringing the concern about conservation to this broader stage and getting the public really interested in the preservation of species.
I think Dennis's overall legacy for the Prince of Wales will be the change from hunting with a rifle to hunting with a camera. And I think that's a fantastic legacy, and so I'm very proud of that.
Edward remained a patron of animal conservation until his abdication, when he handed the torch on to his brother, King George VI, and later Queen Elizabeth II. And it's a torch the family carries to this day.
Today we take it for granted that the royals are concerned about conservation. Every member of the family seems to have his own private cause in that way. Edward was a pioneer. He set a new course for the royal family, and I suppose in so doing he made a very, very considerable contribution to the cause of conservation.